I was tasked to really reflect on thought leadership and becoming change agents. And as I said, this is a topic that I really warmed to because I think in many ways, these are the twin pillars on which the African Renaissance will be built. And so tonight, I want to reflect on these things with you under the title Daring to Invent the Future, Intellectual Activism Toward African Renaissance. And of course, many of you will know that I've borrowed that title, Daring to Invent the Future, from Thomas Sankara. So of course, the spirit is indeed here. Before I begin my remarks, I do want to make one caveat, and to say that during my speech, you'll hear me refer regularly to professionals and academics. And by speaking of this group explicitly tonight, I am by no means implying that people who are economically oppressed, workers, or those without formal education do not have a role to play as change agents. My firm belief, rather, is that they too are and should be called and are called to be what I call intellectual activists, regardless of formal qualifications. My focus this evening on professionals and scholars is based on a couple of factors. One, the unique composition of this audience, and two, on the fact that as professionals, many of you in this room do and will have unique access to traditional corridors of power, access that in many instances was not only unheard of, but actually illegal merely a generation ago. And with this access, you will have new avenues to shape the future. So tonight, let me start with the obvious. It's not news to anyone that we on the continent have a severe set of challenges here in South Africa, across the continent, and throughout the diaspora. They range from poverty to inequality to infrastructure and beyond. And while these problems are very real, to hear some tell it, Africa is ready to implode. Not next week, not tomorrow, but if you believe the New York Times, sometime in the next 60 minutes. This, however, is far from the truth. The truth, I believe, is that this generation, perhaps more so than any other before it, is poised to bring lasting, sustainable change to the continent. A change that will not only improve the economic lives of African people, but a change that will shape Africa, not in the image of the East or the West, but in our own image. When and the extent to which this promise becomes reality is up to us. Simply by being in this space, by choosing to participate in a program of this nature, you have to a certain extent indicated your willingness to be at the vanguard of this change. With that said, some of you might ask why or how it is that I'm so confident about the future of African people. I'm confident because we're heirs. We are heirs to an indelible legacy left by Steve Biko, Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, and countless others. The question is whether or not we will take up our inheritance. The question is whether or not we, in the words of Sankara, dare to invent the future. My submission is that the only way to invent the future, to realize the full potential of ourselves and our continent, is to develop a new culture of activism, an activism that will inspire a movement towards Renaissance, an activism rooted in intellectual inquiry and thought leadership, intellectual activism, if you will. And this evening, I want you to think with me as we unpack this term, intellectual activism, as we examine examples of this type of work and consider how to inculcate its ethos in ourselves and our daily lives. And so let me start by posing a question to you. And we're an intimate enough group, so you can just shout it out. How many of yourselves, just by show of hand, consider yourself to be intellectuals? Oh, guys, the Vice Chancellor, she's not taking notes. You can tell me, how many of you consider yourself? Okay. Now, let me ask another question. When you hear the term intellectual, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Come on, people. Remember, I told you I grew up in the black church. You know, I say something, you say something. What's the one word that comes to mind? Thought leadership, clever, academia, knowledge, thinker. Okay. I think the patron said something. Now I want to know. In the event that you all let me down, I did conduct a poll. And I'm going to be very honest, it was an informal poll. So before all the academics asked about my research methodology, it was actually a Facebook poll. It was my status. And I received a number of responses. Some people said that When they thought of the term intellectual, they thought of something complex. They thought of education, ideological, strategic. Those were the more innocuous answers. Less flattering, brittle brilliance, detached, passive, self-consumed, and needs the approval of others. Thinkers, not doers. There was one definition, which was my favorite, however, and in fairness, it was more than one word, but it said possessing foundational abilities to process information from different angles at great depth, not all knowing or proficient at everything. And what I thought was interesting about this definition from one of my Facebook friends is that it doesn't make a value judgment. It doesn't relate to someone's level of formal education. Rather, it leaves space for a variety of perspectives and positions intellectuals as seekers. And indeed, if you examine African history, our intellectuals have made an indelible contribution to shaping our discourse and trajectory. From Frantz Fanon, who very literally diagnosed the diseases of the oppressed, to Walter Rodney, who in his work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, provided empirical evidence of the effects of colonialism, we have no shortage of thinkers to help inform us as we move forward. The great gift of these intellectuals, however, is that they did not remain in their individual spaces. Rather, their scholarship was informed by the lived reality of African people. And more than that, they practically applied their thinking to addressing challenges facing their communities. And herein lies the critical task for many of us in this room. We are here in a university setting, having examined fascinating aspects of African history, from Egyptology to feminism to economics, and a range of other issues under the auspices of TMALI. Yet since your graduation from the program, to what extent have these teachings shaped your daily approach to your personal and professional lives? Has it simply been about obtaining a qualification from UNISA, from this institute? Was that the objective in and of itself? Or is the objective application of your learning to invent the future? How then do we move beyond thinking, which is the first critical step, to doing? And this now leads to the second part. So my question, how many of you here consider yourselves to be activists? Okay, that's interesting. Now, what is the terminology that comes to mind when you hear the word activist? Fearless. There's a beautiful lady in green. You're very excited. What comes to mind? Ungovernable. Okay. My brother, when you hear the word activist, what comes to mind? Okay. Again, I resorted to Facebook, and this was very interesting. My own brother, who considers me an activist, said militant. Other people said dynamic. Some said liberals. I got doers, down for the cause, passionate, and struggle. Again, though, my favorite definition was change in living form. In reviewing current events, we can see that there are many different types of activism that are being employed by this generation. Among the more recent forms is hashtag activism, probably best exemplified by the Bring Back Our Girls campaign in the wake of Boko Haram kidnapping hundreds of girls from their school in northern Nigeria. Around the world, from Lagos to LA to Laos, people were tweeting with this hashtag. Did the massive amount of Twitter activity eventually bring the girls back? Not directly, no. But did it raise awareness of the situation and put more pressure on governments and international bodies to do more? Some could say yes. Did it lead, however, to a deeper understanding of the dynamics of the Nigerian social-political environment, Boko Haram, and measures that could lead to lasting peace? Definitely not. That is a rather tall order for the 140-character platform that is Twitter. Yet another example of activism is what I call social welfare activism, or charity. This includes activities such as back-to-school shoe drives, wintertime blanket collections, and soup kitchens. Is this brand of activism effective at providing much-needed immediate relief to some of the most vulnerable in society? Definitely. Do activities along these lines address the deep systematic issues that lead to poverty and alienation in the first place? Unfortunately, no. A third type of activism that I would like to highlight is that of protest action. It has been one of the defining features of liberation struggles globally. From Sharpeville to the sit-ins of the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, to Burkina Faso and even Wits today, mass protest has been an indelible and in many instances effective feature of activism. It is in fact this type of intervention that I find people often have in mind when they speak of activism. And a fourth category, of which I am acutely conscious given my own career, is what I call professional activism. This category includes NGOs, public benefit organizations, and other entities established to pursue specific goals in society. Have many of these entities been successful at shaping society, policy, promoting specific issues, and raising awareness about a myriad of matters? Yes. Have the mandates pursued by professional activists always been in the best interest of Africa and her renaissance? No. Have some of the methods used by professional activists, images of famine victims covered in flies, or babies with distended bellies, upheld the dignity of African people? All too often not. And I think these examples, in many ways, speak to the quandary of activism for many. For those of us wanting to contribute to the realization of the Renaissance, we know that we can't hashtag our way to a new future. We know that while food and blankets are essential for many of our people in the short run, we want to create a situation where they're available to all of us in the long run. And truthfully, the latter options, protest action and professional activism, can seem a bit much, perhaps at odds with our images of ourselves and our notions of being intellectuals, professionals, and thought leaders. I think this is why our approach to and views of activism must shift to one of intellectual activism, activity that is thoughtful, considered, and strategic. My approach is that we need to challenge dominant paradigms based on the experiences and aspirations of African people, which enable us to be activists wherever we are, not just online, not just at the occasional march, but daily in our work as professors, business analysts, doctors, and artists. In my view, international activism should be a constant cycle of revisiting ideas, implementing them, and assessing the outcomes of our actions to see if our thinking holds true. And I think this sentiment was perhaps best articulated by Steve Biko when he said, and I quote, "As people existing in a continuous struggle for truth, we have to examine and question old values, concepts, and systems. Having found the right answers, we shall then work for consciousness among all people to make it possible for us to proceed toward putting these answers into effect," unquote. To me, this is the essence of intellectual activism, and Steve Biko's life and work in many ways exemplify this principle. And now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to delve too deeply into the details of Steve Biko's life, but I will make a huge assumption that the majority of the audience has some familiarity. Instead, I'll highlight a few salient points that I think have relevance for us as we consider what it means to be an intellectual activist. I think the first thing that Biko teaches us about activism is to start where we are. When he began the South African Students' Organization with his colleagues in the late 60s, it wasn't because he had all of the answers, but because he saw a need he felt that Black students could effectively address. In 1967, Biko participated as an SRC delegate at the annual NUSIS conference held at Rhodes University. NUSIS was ostensibly a non-racial student group that opposed apartheid. A dispute arose at the conference when the host institution prohibited racially mixed accommodation in compliance with the Group Areas Act. NUSIS professed to abhor this law, but would not oppose it. Instead, they condemned Rhodes officials through statements, while cautioning Black delegates to act within the limits of the law. For Biko, this was a defining moment. Despite claims that individuals and institutions opposed apartheid, they too often did little beyond rhetoric to address it. Seeking an alternative that legitimately represented the aspirations of Black people and not being able to find one, Biko created it. And many of you will know that by the 70s, the influence of SASO and Black consciousness spread well beyond the university campuses and grew into a broad movement that encompassed journalists, artists, educators, high school students, and many, many more. Ironically, to ascertain the full depth and breadth of the movement, one only needs to look at the list of organizations that was banned on October 19, 1977, in the wake of Biko's death. There you will see the diversity of these institutions and individuals. Incidentally, Black Wednesday, as it came to be known, we will mark the 30th anniversary of it on Monday. One of the other things that Biko teaches, and which is most impressive to me about his colleagues, was their commitment to intellectual inquiry, to ideas, to engagement. BC was not a ready-made philosophy that was simply adopted by the successor generation. Rather, they spent time reading, everything from Paulo Freire to Fanon. They synthesized ideas, not to copy them, but to test them against their own experience, and to ultimately develop a worldview and orientation that advanced their struggle. But one indicator of this intellectual process are the terms BC activists used to describe themselves. In the founding documents of SASO, they referred to themselves as non-whites. Yet a few short years later, they were Black and very proudly African, refusing as African people, Asian, and mixed race people to be identified as non-white, amounting to non-entity. And incidentally, again, you see the legacy of this enshrined in our BEE codes and what it means to be Black. Thirdly, Biko demonstrates that we all have the capacity to be activists. While he over time became a professional activist, more by default than design, he didn't start out that way. He was a student who saw a need and stepped in to meet it. While there were many problems he could have addressed, he started on campus, right where he was. As a medical student, clinics and the provision of healthcare were a core part of his work. His activism grew from there. I think the danger, though, of citing Biko as an example of activism is that we may inadvertently fall into what I call the big people syndrome. Often when we think of activists, remarkable people like Biko, Mandela, Thabo, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Angela Davis come to mind. And they are indeed shining examples of activism, change, as my friend said, in living form. Yet what we don't talk about as much are the foot soldiers, not just those who marched and protested alongside the aforementioned activists, but those that were the artisans who literally helped to build local clinics brick by brick. The teachers who voluntarily ran winter schools in defiance of Bantu education, and the lawyers who represented detainees. These people are equally activists in their own right. And please hear me, I am not saying that we should live small or that we should not aspire for greatness or that we should do the bare minimum. Rather, what I'm calling for is that we each thoughtfully embody change in living form. I'm calling for an intellectual activism that is intentional in all areas of our lives, from examining the attitudes we hold, to the ways we raise our children, to the decisions we make in the workplace, to our civic engagements. I'm calling for us to be intellectual activists who daily dare to invent the future. The question then is, how do we become intellectual activists? And I think that there are 4 things we ought to focus on in this pursuit, at least initially. The first is consciousness. Again, it was Biko who said of his work that, and I quote, "We try to get Blacks in conscientization to grapple realistically with their problems, to develop what one might call an awareness of their situation, to be able to analyze it and to provide answers for themselves," unquote. It is important to note that consciousness is not a destination. It is not a particular language or aesthetic, although that may be a manifestation. Consciousness is about engaging with our problems and finding solutions for ourselves. It's about acknowledging that it's both our right as well as our responsibility to decide who we want to be. Consciousness is also about recognizing the ways in which we have been complicit in our own oppression and developing the mental tools to overcome that oppression. Consciousness is a continual reevaluation of who we are, what we believe, and how we live. And allow me, please, again, to reiterate that simply by being in this program, you in many ways have demonstrated your commitment to the ongoing journey of conscientization. Yet, in the same ways that we view activism or intellectualism in a particular light, I suspect that we may take other things for granted as well, things that are indicative of an attitude that will ultimately impede renaissance. I think the next thing we require, if we are to become intellectual activists, is courage. I had a conversation with a young man a few years ago, and we somehow got into the topic of transformation and how few Black professionals there were, etc. And my point was that if each of us Black professionals simply reached out to and mentored others, over time there would be more Black professionals, and ostensibly different approaches to social challenges in the workplace. His retort, if you do the right thing, you won't get your bonus. Keep in mind he was 25, a stockbroker for one of the large financial institutions, and judging from his German-made car, doing quite well on base salary alone. The bonus was pretty much money to go to Fiji. In the case of the stockbroker, we see that he is clear about what his role ought to be. He's just unwilling to make the sacrifice to do it. And I use the word sacrifice, but let's be honest, Robben Island is closed. The consequences of advocating for African people are far different than what they were just 2 decades ago. With that said, are there social, professional, and economic costs to advancing African Renaissance? Yes, but the costs are not as high as they used to be. I think the third thing we need to do is to commit to ongoing critical analysis. I touched on this above when speaking of Sasso, so here I just want to reiterate that it's about ongoing deepening, exploring issues from new angles, going beyond the usual, seeking new paradigms. And again, to quote Thomas Sankara, because he said it very well, our revolution is not a public speaking tournament. Our revolution is not a battle of fine phrases. Our revolution is not simply for spouting slogans that are no more than signals used by manipulators trying to use them as catchwords, as code words, as a foil for their own display. Our revolution is and should continue to be the collective effort of revolutionaries to transform reality, to improve the concrete situation of the masses. And then the fourth thing we need, and this is the most important thing, we need commitment. And not just the idea of commitment. We need commitment that manifests itself in action. We can't all do everything, but we can each do something. When we look at the genesis of so many movements in South Africa and across the continent, much of it lies in the conditions of the time. But if you look at the case of Biko, it was also about taking that first step of walking out of that NUSIS conference at Rhodes University. And when he didn't find the alternative he needed, having the commitment to create it, creating spaces where Black people could invent the future. As I close, I just want to share some practical examples with you of what this could look like. A few weeks ago, I met an African-American gentleman who is in the medical field. He shared with me that as a medical resident in the US in the 1980s, his class had one of the largest contingents of Black folks the hospital had ever seen. There were 8 of them. Basically, instead of 1 hand, they needed 2 hands to count the Black people on. They knew of Steve Biko, and they knew of his death. And they were intrigued by the idea that he started out as a medical student. So they came together to form what they called the Biko Collective and to read I Write What I Like. They were so engaged by Biko's example that they put together a policy paper on inequalities within the medical system in the city, and also challenged the way in which their internship was run, calling for a more holistic education that examined poverty, race, and their impact on health. He shared that all these decades later, he's still in touch with members of the collective, and that critically, this early experience shaped the ways in which they have each practiced over the years, improving the quality of care for thousands of patients. Today, this gentleman is no longer a medical doctor, but he is one of the few Black people working in large international philanthropic organizations. And he's continued to cultivate these learning experiences for himself and his colleagues. And as such, his view as an international donor of grantees in Africa is very different than others. And so his advocacy is from a point of partnership and mutual responsibility, not dictating to Africans. Similarly, just this past weekend, I met an Afro-German woman in Munich whose son is 16. And because he was raised by conscious parents, in his history class, there is only one section on Africa. And this entire section is presented that Africa is not even one continent, it's a country apparently, is besieged by poverty, disease, and that's it. He knew that this was a racist lie, and he told his teacher so. His teacher responded by saying, "You're being overly sensitive." He responded, "Oh, this I should be very sensitive about." And so he took the offensive material home to his mother, who, incensed, called on the parents of the 2 other Black students in his class to address this issue. They, together with other local parents, created an anti-racist teaching guide that has been distributed throughout their son's school and the entire city. Following this victory, the parents have partnered with a professor and publisher to produce an African history textbook. In this way, they have shaped pedagogy about Africa for years to come. And when we talk about intellectual activism, these are some of the examples that come to mind. Each of us doing what we can, where we can, from a considered methodological point of view. In this vein, we can make real the vision articulated by Patrice Lumumba in his final letter to his wife, when he prophesied that Africa will write its own history, and it will be to the north and to the south of the Sahara a history of glory and dignity. I thank you.